Jesus was killed by the Jews. Now, bear in mind that he had raised Lazarus from the dead. Did you know that soon after they killed Lazarus too? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, good day to you. That's depending where you are in the world. We're doing the nighttime devotion from the devotional Christ Triumphant. The title today is My House Shall Be Called a House of Prayer. Matthew 21 verse 12. And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the moneychangers and the seats of them that sold doves. The temple courts were filled with cattle, sheep, oxen, and doves. Above the noise of the lowing of cattle, the bleating of the sheep, and the cooing of the doves, could be heard the voices of the traffickers as they offered for sale the animals and birds at the highest rates to those who had come to the Passover to offer sacrifice. Jesus said, "It is written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves." This act on the part of Christ was deeply significant, more significant than any of the beholders realized. When the priests and Pharisees had recovered from the terror that had taken possession of their guilty souls at the words of Christ, they returned to the temple. They were not converted or even humbled. They determined to challenge Christ as to his authority for expelling them from the temple courts. When they reached the temple, they found that a wonderful work had been done during their absence. The sick and dying had been restored to health. They were astonished, but they would not yield their stubborn unbelief. They had already determined to put Christ to death, and Lazarus also, who had been raised from the dead. They knew that the people would still believe in Jesus as long as there lived among them one who had been raised from the dead by his power. The evidence Christ had given was calculated to convince every sincere mind, but it was not evidence that these people wanted. It was the rejection and condemnation of the Christ by the people for which they were seeking. Every additional evidence given only increased their aversion to Christ. To have Christ in the world, performing his wonderful works, to have him live before the people his life of goodness and self-denial and self-sacrifice, to have him exercise for others the tender compassion that had long since departed from their lives, was the very thing they did not want. Christ was fulfilling the commission given him by his Father. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison for them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. The title again, My House Shall Be Called a House of Prayer. So this focuses mainly on when Jesus came to the temple and he found it full of cattle, sheep, oxen and doves, money exchangers, and he overturned all the tables and the money and drove out all the people selling the animals or And he said, this is a house of prayer. And you basically turned it to a den of thieves, a marketplace. The temple was originally built and consecrated to do the work for God, so God could dwell among his people, his spirit. And of course, with all this going on, that cannot happen. And it was a farce, complete farce. It was just turned into a means to make money. And that's why the Pharisees and the rabbis, etc., allowed them to do that. They obviously paid them to allow them to be there. And they were astonished at what Jesus had done. Whose authority would he dare to go in and do all this? When it's the Pharisees and the rabbis and the teachers that controlled that environment. But they were shocked to see that Jesus had healed all the sick, lame, blind. But they chose to ignore it and still remain stubborn and prideful until Jesus reminded them, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach, teach, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to the captives, opening the prison for them that are bound by sin, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. My house shall be called a house of prayer. That was the temple then. We, each of us individually, are the temple now. How are we desecrating our temple, our bodies, our minds, so that God cannot dwell within us?